In September 1943, deep within a Norwegian fjord, the most powerful battleship in Hitler's navy sat protected by nets, mines and mountains. The Tirpitz, 45,000 tons of steel that had terrorized Allied convoys, seemed untouchable. Conventional bombers had failed, surface ships couldn't reach her, but 6 tiny submarines, each just 51 feet long, were about to prove that Britain's greatest weapon wasn't size, it was audacity. What the Germans never discovered until it was too late would shatter their pride and their keel. Portsmouth, January 1942, 0300 hours. Rain hammered the corrugated roof of Blockhouse Fort as Commander Cromwell Varley stood before a scale model of the Tirpitz, steam rising from his tea in the unheated briefing room. The temperature hovered near freezing. Outside, the sound of air raid sirens tested their nightly wail, a reminder that Britain was far from winning this war. Varley's hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from exhaustion. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. The strategic situation was deteriorating with mathematical precision. Since January 1942, the Tirpitz had been operational in Norwegian waters, and her mere existence was bleeding Britain white. Arctic convoys to Russia, Britain's desperate ally, were being decimated. PQ-17 had lost 24 of 35 merchant ships the previous July, over 140,000 tons of cargo sent to the bottom alongside 153 merchant seamen. The Admiralty's response had been to suspend convoys entirely for 2 months, a decision that Stalin had called cowardice. The home fleet was paralyzed, forced to maintain massive capital ships at Scapa Flow just to counter the theoretical threat of Tirpitz breaking out into the Atlantic. The cost was crippling. Fuel, manpower and ships desperately needed elsewhere, all immobilized by a single vessel hiding in a fjord. Every conventional option had failed spectacularly. RAF Bomber Command had launched operation after operation, 242 sorties in total by September 1942, dropping over 500 tons of bombs on the fjord. Result: 0 hits on the battleship, 33 aircraft lost, 231 aircrew dead or captured. The numbers were unsustainable. Surface attacks were suicide. Coastal batteries and geography made approach impossible. The Strategic Warfare Executive had even attempted a commando raid in October 1942, Operation Title, using modified motor torpedo boats called chariots. All 4 boats were lost in heavy seas before reaching the target. 12 men drowned. The Admiralty was running out of ideas, and the shipping losses were accelerating. Lieutenant Donald Cameron was 27 years old, born in Carluke, Scotland, with the kind of face that looked perpetually windburned from Highland winters. He joined the Royal Navy Reserve in 1939, commanded a minesweeper off Dunkirk, and watched 3 ships sink beneath him before his 25th birthday. When he volunteered for special and hazardous service in late 1941, he wasn't seeking glory, he was seeking effectiveness. Traditional warfare was killing his friends wholesale while achieving nothing. The X-Craft program had begun in 1942, born from desperation and the British capacity for unconventional thinking. Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, had seen Italian frogmen cripple HMS Queen Elizabeth in Alexandria with limpet mines and thought, if they can do it, why can't we do it better? The concept was audacious to the point of madness. Build submarines so small they could slip through defenses, yet carry explosive charges large enough to break the spine of a battleship. Each X-craft would be 51 feet long, displace just 30 tons surfaced, carry a crew of 4, and somehow penetrate the most heavily defended anchorage in occupied Europe. The initial proposal was met with institutional skepticism. Rear Admiral Claude Barry had called it a death sentence wrapped in wishful thinking. The director of naval construction pointed out that no submarine that small had ever successfully attacked anything larger than a fishing boat. The propulsion calculations alone seemed impossible. Diesel engines, powerful enough to make the transit from Scotland to Norway, wouldn't fit in such a tiny hull. The answer was tow wage. X-craft would be towed 200 miles across the North Sea by conventional submarines. then released to attack independently. It was complicated, untested, and relied on weather cooperation that the North Atlantic rarely provided. Construction began at Vickers Armstrong in Barrow-in-Furness in early 1942, under conditions of extreme secrecy and extreme scarcity. Britain's shipyards were already operating at 142% of theoretical capacity, working around the clock to replace merchant tonnage faster than U-boats could sink it. Steel allocation for experimental submarines was nearly impossible to justify. Materials had to be borrowed from other projects, component deliveries delayed because bombed railways couldn't guarantee schedules. The first prototype, X-3, wasn't launched until March 1942, and her sea trials revealed catastrophic problems: steering failures, compass deviation from the steel hull, carbon dioxide buildup that rendered crews unconscious within 6 hours. The human cost of development was immediate. During trials in Loch Cairnborne, X-5 suffered a hydrogen explosion from charging batteries in confined spaces. Sub-Lieutenant Joseph Brooks and engine room artificer Henry Fishley died from burns and toxic inhalation. The incident report noted that safety protocols from larger submarines were inadequate for vessels where the engine room was literally 2 feet from the sleeping quarters. Modifications were made: better ventilation, revised battery chemistry, additional fire suppression. Each change added weight and complexity that threatened performance margins. By September 1942, 6 X-craft were operational, X-5 through X-10. Crew selection had been brutal. Over 300 volunteers, submariners already considered the elite, competed for 24 positions. The requirements were specific: small physical stature to fit through 18-inch diameter hatches, technical competence to operate systems with almost no redundancy, psychological stability to endure confinement that made conventional submarines feel spacious, and a particular kind of fatalism that accepted 50% casualty projections as acceptable odds. The training regime was conducted at HMS Varble in Scotland throughout the winter of 1942-43. Crews practiced attacks on decommissioned hulks in sea locks, learning to navigate under anti-submarine nets by feel, to place charges with precision using only periscope observation, to escape defensive minefields while surfaced just enough to breathe through the induction trunk. Lieutenant Godfrey Place, commanding X-7, completed 47 practice approaches before declaring his crew ready. His first diver, Sub-Lieutenant Robert Aitken, spent so many hours in frigid Scottish waters that he developed permanent nerve damage in his hands, but refused medical discharge. The target was confirmed in May 1943 through photographic reconnaissance. Tirpitz lay in Kofjord, an inlet off Altafjord in northern Norway, surrounded by 3 layers of anti-torpedo nets extending 60 feet deep, with patrol boats, shore batteries, and a garrison of 2,000 German personnel. The operational plan, codenamed Operation Source, called for 6 X-craft to be towed to a release point 150 miles off the Norwegian coast, then navigate independently through minefields, past destroyer patrols, under the nets, and plant 2-ton Amatol charges beneath Tirpitz's keel. The charges were shaped to focus the explosive force upward, breaking the ship's spine rather than just damaging the hull plating. The final briefing occurred at HMS Bonaventure on 11 September 1943. Commander Cromwell Varley stood before the assembled crews and spoke with characteristic British understatement. "Gentlemen, you are being asked to accomplish what the entire RAF and Royal Navy have failed to achieve. If you succeed, you will save thousands of Allied lives by eliminating the strategic threat that has paralyzed our Arctic operations. If you fail, your deaths will be recorded as training accidents because this operation officially does not exist. The odds of survival are estimated at 1 in 10. Are there any questions?" Sub-Lieutenant Richard Kendall raised his hand and asked if they'd still get their tea ration before departure. The room erupted in laughter, that particularly British defence mechanism against acknowledging terror. Varley smiled tightly. The galley will provide a full thermos for each crew. Now get some rest. You sail at dawn. The operational deployment began on 11th of September 1943, at 1600 hours under grey skies that threatened the autumn gales already building across the North Sea. 6 X-craft, X5, X6, X7, X8, X9, and X10 were secured behind their parent submarines, HMS Truculent, Tirpitz, Stubborn, Sea Nymph, Tirpitz, and Scepter. Each X-craft had a passage crew of 4 for the 200-mile tow, with the operational crew following in the parent submarine to remain fresh for the attack. The tow speed was set at 7 knots. Any faster risked breaking the nylon hawser, any slower wouldn't reach the release point before the operational window closed. The North Atlantic immediately demonstrated why it held strategic significance beyond mere geography. It was genuinely hostile to human ambition. By 13th of September, wind speeds reached 35 knots with 15-foot swells. Inside X6, Passage Crew Commander Lieutenant John Lorimer recorded in his log, temperature 4 degrees, constant water seepage through periscope gland, impossible to prepare hot food, crew sleeping in shifts because bunks too wet. Compass deviation worsening, magnetic field from parent sub's propellers interfering with our instruments, navigation reduced to dead reckoning and prayer. The diesel exhaust fumes that leaked back through the induction trunk caused continuous nausea. Lorimer noted that able seaman Bill Whitley vomited 14 times in 18 hours, but refused relief because someone needs to watch the depth gauge. The first casualty occurred on 15th September. X8, under tow behind Sea Nymph and carrying charges intended for Lutzow, suffered flooding in the battery compartment from a cracked hull weld that hadn't shown during pressure testing. The acidic seawater mixed with battery electrolyte created chlorine gas, the same poison that had killed thousands in the trenches of the previous war. Engine room. Artificer Jack Robinson held his breath, entered the compartment wearing the single emergency breathing set, and manually isolated the batteries before losing consciousness. He was dragged out by Sub-Lieutenant Jack Smart with chemical burns across his face and hands. The X-8 was ordered to jettison her charges and abort. Robinson survived, but never recovered full vision in his left eye. He later said the worst part wasn't the pain, but knowing his submarine would accomplish nothing after all that suffering. X9 simply disappeared. At 0320 hours on 16th of September, HMS Tirpitz surfaced to check the tow and found only the severed hawser trailing behind. The X9, her passage crew of 4, and the operational crew waiting to transfer, 8 men total, including Lieutenant Terence Martin, who'd survived the sinking of HMS Hood, were gone without trace. Post-war analysis suggested the hawser parted during a particularly violent pitch. The X-craft broached and flooded through her open induction trunk before anyone could react. There was no time for distress signals. They likely drowned within 90 seconds, still 400 miles from the Norwegian coast. The operation continued because turning back would make their deaths meaningless. By 18th September, the surviving X-craft reached the release point designated Position Z, 150 miles off Soroy Island. The passage crews transferred back to the parent submarines, and the operational crews took over. This moment marked a psychological transition as profound as any in warfare. Inside X6, Lieutenant Donald Cameron watched the hatch seal and knew that everything from this point was his responsibility alone. The 4 men in this tiny steel tube, himself, Sub-Lieutenant Dickie Kendall as First Lieutenant, ERA Edmund Goddard on the engine, and Sub-Lieutenant John Lorimer as diver, were now operationally autonomous. No communications, no reinforcements, no rescue if things went wrong. The parent submarines would wait 72 hours, then return to Scotland whether the X-craft came back or not. The approach to Kofjord required navigating minefields that German engineers had been refining for 18 months. The mines were magnetic and acoustic, triggered by the metal mass of a ship's hull or the noise of her propellers. X-craft was small enough and quiet enough to theoretically slip through, but theoretically had killed more submariners than enemy action. Cameron ran on the surface whenever possible, using the cover of darkness and making only 6 knots to minimize acoustic signature. The diesel engine coughed and sputtered on low-grade fuel. Britain's best petroleum was reserved for bombers. Submarines made do with what Norwegian resistance could smuggle or what could be refined from coal tar. The smell was nauseating even in open air. The Norwegian coast appeared at dawn on 20th September, grey mountains shrouded in low cloud, snow visible on peaks even in September. The geography was spectacular and tactically murderous. Fjords carved by glaciers created narrow channels where patrol boats could monitor every square meter of water. The Germans had established a listening station on every headland, hydrophones detecting submerged contacts at ranges up to 5 kilometers. X-7, commanded by Lieutenant Godfrey Place, ran submerged at 90 feet, navigating by dead reckoning because periscope depth was suicide in these patrolled waters. Place later described it as sailing blind through a canyon, hoping your calculations about tide and current are accurate enough that you don't hit a wall. Inside the X-craft, operational reality was medieval despite the technological sophistication. The crew wore wool submariner sweaters because there was no heating. Condensation from their breath turned to frost on the steel bulkheads. Food was cold bully beef and hard biscuits because cooking generated carbon dioxide faster than the scrubbers could process it. The toilet was a bucket behind a canvas curtain, emptied through a valve that required precise pressure equalization to avoid flooding the cabin. ERA Goddard became expert at this humiliating but crucial task. Sleep was impossible in any conventional sense. Men dozed in 30-minute intervals while wedged against equipment, waking with cramps so severe they needed massage to regain mobility. The first defensive belt was breached on the night of 20th September. X-6 and X-7 slipped through the boom defenses at the entrance to Altafjord by following a German patrol boat through the opened gate, a tactic requiring precision timing and nerves that Cameron described as playing chicken with people who will shoot you if they notice. X-5, commanded by Lieutenant Henty Creer, attempted the same maneuver, but was forced to dive when searchlights swept the water. She struck the boom net at 60 feet, became entangled, and spent 4 hours cutting free, using wire cutters operated through a hull hatch while German sentries walked 200 feet above. The noise was horrific, metal scraping metal, but the wind and waves masked it just enough. Henty Creer's log recorded simply, "Net cleared, Aero 340 HRs proceeding." The approach to Kofjord itself began at dawn on 22nd September. Tirpitz was visible through periscope, a massive dark grey shape surrounded by smaller vessels like a queen bee among workers. The sight was both exhilarating and terrifying. This single ship had cost Britain hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping, thousands of lives, and immeasurable strategic flexibility. Now she lay 2,000 yards away, oblivious to the tiny predators stalking her. But between the X-craft and their target lay the final defenses, 3 concentric rings of anti-torpedo nets extending 60 feet deep, patrol boats making continuous sweeps, and enough explosive charges to vaporize anything detected. X-6 made her penetration attempt at 07:15 hours. Cameron brought the boat to periscope depth and identified a gap in the nets, a 30-foot opening where a supply boat had passed through minutes earlier. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the gate closed. The approach run required perfect buoyancy control. Too deep and they'd strike the net bottom, too shallow and they'd be spotted. ERA Goddard pumped trim tanks by hand while monitoring the depth gauge with millimeter precision. Cameron later wrote, "We slid through that gap with 6 inches clearance on either side. Kendall counted down the distance, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, and then we were inside. No alarms, no gunfire, just the sound of our own breathing." X-7 followed different tactics. Lieutenant Place found the nets extended too deep for a gap entry, so he decided to go under. At 0730 hours, X7 settled on the fjord bottom at 90 feet, directly beneath the nets. Place then flooded negative tanks to make the submarine heavy and used the propeller to drive her forward along the seabed like a tractor, scraping under the net bottom. The noise was catastrophic inside the hull. Steel grinding against rock, the net cables scraping overhead. But at 0751 hours, Place brought her up to 40 feet on the opposite side of the defences, inside the anchorage perimeter. His diver, Sub-Lieutenant Aitken, examined the hull afterwards and counted 37 separate impact marks. The periscope was bent 15 degrees but still functional. Place's only comment was, "Well, we're in. Now the interesting bit." At precisely 02 hours on 22nd September 1943, X6 surfaced to periscope depth 150 yards from Tirpitz's port side. Through the scratched lens, Lieutenant Cameron could see German sailors on deck, conducting morning routine, scrubbing, painting, walking with the relaxed posture of men who believed themselves invulnerable. The battleship's grey hull rose like a steel cliff, gun turrets massive enough to house a small cottage. For 18 months, this ship had terrorized the Allied war effort. Now, 150 yards away, 4 British submariners in a vessel smaller than a fishing boat were about to change that equation permanently. The charges had to be placed with geometric precision. Each X-craft carried 2 side cargoes, 2-ton amatol charges in hull containers that could be released to sink beneath the target. The charges were fitted with clockwork timers set for 1 hour, enough time to escape, but not enough for the Germans to locate and defuse them. Cameron maneuvered X6 directly beneath Tirpitz's engine room, the structural weak point where the keel was thinnest. At 0820 hours, ERA Goddard operated the release mechanism. There was a muffled clank as the port charge dropped free. Cameron felt the submarine rise slightly, 4 tons lighter, and repositioned 50 yards forward. At 0825 hours, the starboard charge followed, placed beneath the forward magazine. X7, meanwhile, had encountered catastrophic mechanical failure. The periscope, damaged during the net transit, began flooding at 0805 hours. Water sprayed into the control compartment at high pressure, shorting electrical systems and causing compass failure. Lieutenant Place was navigating blind, relying entirely on sound and intuition. He surfaced briefly at 0828 hours, close enough to Tirpitz that German sailors on deck could have thrown cigarettes aboard, and Place glimpsed the battleship's position before diving again. Despite having no instruments, Place positioned X7 beneath Tirpitz's keel through dead reckoning and released both charges at 0832 and 0834 hours. The placement was textbook, one beneath the engine room, one beneath the main armament magazines. Place later admitted, "I had no idea where we were. I just knew we were under something very large, and that was good enough." The German response initially followed the pattern of institutional disbelief that had characterized their entire defensive posture. At 0836 hours, a lookout on Tirpitz's stern reported seeing a periscope. The duty officer, Korvettenkapitän Hans Meyer, assumed it was a seal. Marine life frequently triggered false alarms. At 0841 hours, X6 surfaced accidentally after her depth control mechanism failed from water damage. She broke surface 80 yards from Tirpitz, fully visible in morning sunlight. Alarm bells began ringing immediately. Sailors rushed to battle stations. Destroyer Z-27 began an approach run. But even then, Meyer's first report described small surface contact of unknown type. German doctrine had no category for midget submarines because such vessels were considered too primitive for modern warfare. X-6 was immediately subjected to withering fire. 20mm cannon shells tore through her ballast tanks. Cameron attempted to dive, but the damage was catastrophic. She was sinking bow first with flooding, spreading faster than pumps could manage. At 0847 hours, with water reaching the battery compartment and chlorine gas forming, Cameron made the only decision possible. Abandon ship, set scuttling charges. Out now. The 4 crew members scrambled through the hatch into Norwegian waters at Sea, swimming toward the nearest land, which happened to be Tirpitz's starboard beam. German sailors threw lifebelts and pulled them aboard at 0851 hours. Cameron, dripping and shivering, was brought before Captain Zursay Hans Meyer in the wardroom. Meyer spoke excellent English, learned at Cambridge before the war. His first question was, "How many of you are out there?" Cameron responded, "Just us. Training accident." Meyer smiled without humor. "Lieutenant, you are either spectacularly incompetent or spectacularly brave. Which is it?" X7's fate was more prolonged. After releasing her charges, Place attempted withdrawal, but became entangled in the anti-torpedo nets at 0853 hours. For the next 45 minutes, X7 struggled to break free while the clock ticked toward detonation. Place blew all ballast tanks repeatedly, attempting to rocket the submarine upward through the nets. Each time, the boat broke surface briefly before cable snares dragged her back down. German patrol boats converged, dropping small depth charges that cracked welds and worsened flooding. At 0908 hours, Place surfaced one final time and shouted at his crew, "We're not getting out. Abandon ship. That's an order." Sub-Lieutenant Aitken and Place escaped through the hatch. ERA Whittam and able seaman Whitley were trapped below when the submarine sank back to 60 feet, still entangled. They drowned in darkness while listening to German propellers overhead. Place and Aitken swam for 15 minutes in freezing water before being captured by a patrol boat crew who treated them with unexpected kindness, offering blankets and schnapps before imprisonment. At precisely 0902 hours, the charges detonated. Cameron, sitting in Tirpitz's wardroom under guard, felt the deck heave upward violently. Teacups flew off the table, light fixtures shattered. The ship's massive bulk lifted several feet vertically, 45,000 tons of battleship-defying gravity for a moment, before crashing back down. The sound was beyond description. Not an explosion, but a fundamental cracking noise, like the earth splitting. In engineering spaces 4 decks below, the force was apocalyptic. Chief Engineer Kapitän Leutnant Otto Bohlen described the scene in his post-action report. The keel broke amidships with a sound like a cannon firing. The ship flexed like wood, not steel, and then settled at a 3-degree list to port. Seams opened throughout the engine rooms. Water entered at catastrophic rates. Turbine mountings sheared completely. The starboard turbine assembly, weighing 120 tons, shifted 4 feet from its foundation. All power failed simultaneously. Emergency lighting showed flooding spreading faster than our pumps could manage. The German reaction progressed through predictable stages: denial, confusion, then panic. Captain Meyer's first damage report at 0950 hours described probable mine strike, damage assessment ongoing. By 0925 hours, the reality became undeniable. All 3 propeller shafts were warped beyond function. The steering mechanism was jammed. Fuel tanks were ruptured, leaking heavy oil that created a surface slick visible for miles. Most critically, structural damage to the keel and hull frames meant Tirpitz would never sail under her own power again. She was effectively a stationary artillery platform, and even that function was compromised. The main gun directors were offline from electrical failure. Fire control systems inoperative, ammunition hoists jammed. But the German command structure couldn't accept this immediately. Admiral Otto Schneewind, commanding Naval Group North, sent a signal at 10:30 hours demanding Tirpitz prepare for sea operations within 72 hours. Engineering reports contradicted this so thoroughly that the Admiral ordered 3 independent damage assessments, convinced subordinates were exaggerating. The final report, submitted at 1600 hours by dockyard inspectors from Hamburg, was devastating. Repairs require minimum 9 months in fully equipped shipyard facility with dry dock capable of handling 45,000-ton displacement. No such facility exists in Norway. Ship must be towed to Germany or written off as total loss. Current seaworthiness, 0. Probability of successful tow through Allied-controlled waters, negligible. The strategic implications detonated more slowly, but with equal force. By 24 September, British signals intelligence intercepted German communications, acknowledging Tirpitz was non-operational. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet, received confirmation at 0800 hours on 25 September. His response was characteristic British understatement. "Gentlemen, we no longer need to maintain capital ship coverage against Tirpitz breakout scenarios. Reassign fleet units accordingly." Within 72 hours, battleships and heavy cruisers that had been pinned to Scapa Flow for 18 months were redeployed, some to the Mediterranean to support Italian operations, others to the Pacific to counter Japanese expansion. Arctic convoys to Russia resumed at full scale immediately. The November 1943 convoy series delivered 270,000 tons of war material without a single ship lost to surface attack. X5, commanded by Lieutenant Henty Krier, was never seen again after entering Kofjord. German records indicate she was detected by hydrophones at 0925 hours and attacked with depth charges from destroyer Z-27. Oil and debris surfaced at 0947 hours. All 4 crew members were killed instantly when their pressure hull imploded at 200 feet. Their bodies were never recovered. Post-war analysis suggests Henty Krier successfully placed at least one charge near the battleship Scharnhorst, moored 800 yards from Tirpitz, but the charge failed to detonate due to timer malfunction. X-10, targeting Scharnhorst, suffered periscope failure and compass breakdown, forcing abort before reaching the inner fjord. Her crew survived. The full magnitude of Operation Source's success only became apparent through the slow, grinding mathematics of strategic warfare. Tirpitz never returned to operational status. German engineers worked throughout the winter of 1943-44, attempting repairs in the inadequate facilities at Trondheim. They replaced 2,000 meters of hull plating, installed new propeller shafts, rebuilt turbine foundations. But the structural keel damage was irreparable without dry dock facilities that didn't exist within 1,500 miles. By March 1944, the vessel could manage 9 knots for short distances, laughably inadequate for a battleship designed for 30-knot combat operations. She remained in Norwegian waters, increasingly degraded, until November 1944, when RAF Lancaster bombers finally sank her with tallboy bombs. But those 14 months of non-operation represented the true victory. Tirpitz posed zero strategic threat after September 1943, and 6 tiny submarines accomplished what years of conventional warfare had failed to achieve. The human cost was calculated with the precision that warfare demands. Of the 6 X-craft that departed Scotland, only 1 returned, X-10, which aborted due to mechanical failure. X-5, X-8, and X-9 were total losses with all hands, 18 men killed. X-6 and X-7 completed their missions but were scuttled or destroyed. 4 crew captured from X-6, 2 captured, and 2 killed from X-7. The final tally, 18 dead, 6 prisoners of war, 4 returned safely. A 70% casualty rate would be considered catastrophic in most contexts, but measured against the strategic objective achieved, it represented warfare's brutal calculus at its most effective. Those 18 deaths potentially saved thousands of Allied merchant seamen and hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping from convoy attacks that Tirpitz would never launch. The prisoners of war endured their own form of warfare. Lieutenant Donald Cameron and his 3 crew members from X-6 spent 20 months in Malag-Melag Nordkamp near Bremen, where they were subjected to repeated interrogation attempts. German intelligence desperately wanted technical details about the X-craft, how they navigated, how they breached defenses, whether more attacks were planned. Cameron's response to every question was name, rank, and serial number, delivered with the weary patience of a schoolteacher correcting a slow pupil. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Brodder, the interrogation officer, later wrote that Cameron possessed an infuriating British quality of making his captors feel they were the ones inconvenienced by his capture. Cameron was liberated by advancing Allied forces in April 1945, weighing 35 pounds less than at capture, but with every technical secret intact. Lieutenant Godfrey Place, captured from X7, faced particular scrutiny because German engineers couldn't comprehend how he'd navigated without functioning instruments. In December 1943, Place was taken to Tirpitz's dry dock facility and asked to explain his navigation methods. He stood before the damaged keel, the massive crack running 40 feet amidships, and said simply, "We aimed for the middle and hoped for the best. Appears we got lucky." The German engineering officer Korvettenkapitän Hans Meyer shook his head in disbelief. "You destroyed a 45,000-ton battleship with hope and luck?" Place smiled slightly, that particularly British expression of modesty masking pride. "No, sir. We destroyed it with 4 tons of amatol placed very precisely beneath your keel. The hope and luck just got us there." Meyer had no response to that. The formal recognition came with typical bureaucratic delay. In February 1944, the London Gazette announced that Lieutenant Donald Cameron and Lieutenant Godfrey Place had been awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honour, for valour in the face of the enemy of the highest order. The citations were uncharacteristically effusive, displaying courage, determination and skill of an exceptional order. They penetrated the formidable defences surrounding a German capital unit, placed explosive charges of devastating effect, and withdrew in the face of overwhelming odds. ERA Edmund Goddard and Sub-Lieutenant Dickie Kendall received Distinguished Service Orders. Sub-Lieutenant Robert Aitken, despite surviving, received the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously. Administrative error assumed he died with XA7, and the correction took 6 months to process. The deceased crew members received no formal recognition until 1948, when a memorial plaque was installed at HMS Dolphin, Gosport, listing all 18 names under the simple inscription, "They attacked the unattackable." The long-term strategic transformation extended far beyond Tirpitz's neutralization. Operation Source validated midget submarine warfare as viable military doctrine, leading to expanded X-craft production and deployment. By 1944, 12 additional X-craft were operational, conducting missions in the Pacific against Japanese shipping, in Norwegian waters against coastal infrastructure, and in support of D-Day operations clearing beach obstacles. The concept matured into the XE-class submarines, which in July 1945 successfully attacked Japanese cruisers Takao and Miyoko in Singapore Harbour, employing nearly identical tactics to those used against Tirpitz. The lineage continues. Modern Special Forces submersibles trace direct doctrinal ancestry to those 1943 X-craft designs. The cultural impact resonated through post-war Britain with particular power. The story of 6 tiny submarines attacking the most powerful battleship in Hitler's navy became symbolic of something fundamental about British character: the refusal to accept defeat, the capacity for innovation under constraint, the willingness to attempt the impossible when conventional methods failed. Churchill referenced Operation Source in his 1945 victory speech, saying, "When our enemies believed themselves invulnerable, protected by geography and fortification, British ingenuity and British courage proved that audacity, combined with technical excellence, could achieve what brute force could not." The operation was declassified in stages. Basic details in 1947, technical specifications in 1958, full operational records in 1973. Each release generated renewed public interest, cementing Operation Source in the pantheon of British military operations alongside the dambusters and cockleshell heroes. The individuals who survived carried the experience with varying degrees of visibility. Lieutenant Cameron returned to civilian life, becoming a teacher in Scotland, and rarely spoke of his wartime service. When pressed by students, he would say only, "I did my duty," same as millions of others. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. He died in 1961, age 44, from complications related to tuberculosis contracted in the POW camp. Lieutenant Place remained in the Royal Navy, retiring as a Rear Admiral in 1970, after a distinguished career that included command of multiple submarines and strategic planning roles. He kept a photograph of X-7's crew in his office throughout his life. When asked what the photo meant, he would respond, "Reminder of what determination and 4 tons of explosive can accomplish." The widows and families of the deceased crew faced the particular cruelty of wartime secrecy. When X-9 disappeared in September 1943, the families of those 8 men received telegrams stating only "missing on operational service." No details, no context, no explanation. For many, the not knowing was worse than confirmed death. Mrs. Sarah Martin, wife of X-9's commander, campaigned for 5 years to learn what happened to her husband. When Operation Source was declassified in 1947, and she learned that Terence had likely drowned when the tow cable parted. Death without glory, without enemy action, just mechanical failure and cold water, she wrote to the Admiralty, "Thank you for finally telling me how my husband died. The truth, even when painful, is better than years of imagining." The government awarded her a widow's pension of $3 per week, standard rate for a lieutenant's widow, and a certificate acknowledging her husband's sacrifice. It was inadequate compensation for a life interrupted, but it was what the system provided. The German perspective added layers of complexity to the historical record. Post-war interviews with Tirpitz's crew revealed widespread recognition that they'd been defeated by superior tactics rather than superior force. Captain Hans Meyer, who interrogated Cameron and Place, wrote in his 1952 memoir, "These British submariners accomplished with courage and ingenuity what hundreds of bombers and thousands of men could not achieve. I could not help but respect them, even as I was obligated to imprison them. They demonstrated a particularly British form of warfare, understated, unconventional, and devastatingly effective." Several Tirpitz survivors maintained correspondence with ex-craft veterans after the war, forming the kind of mutual respect that sometimes emerges between adversaries who recognize professional competence. The operational lessons were studied extensively by NATO forces during the Cold War, particularly regarding asymmetric warfare against superior enemies. The X-craft model, small, stealthy platforms delivering disproportionate strategic impact, became a template for special operations doctrine. The concept that conventional superiority could be negated by unconventional tactics, that geography and fortification could be overcome through innovation, that small units of highly trained personnel could achieve what massed forces could not, these became foundational principles in special warfare thinking. The US Navy SEALs, British Special Boat Service, and Soviet Spetsnaz all incorporated elements of X-craft operational methodology into their training and doctrine. The final assessment requires confronting the uncomfortable question, was it worth it? 18 men died. 6 more spent years as prisoners. 4 tons of explosives placed beneath a battleship's keel in exchange for 18 lives. The arithmetic seems brutal until measured against the alternative. Tirpitz's continued operation would likely have devastated Arctic convoys throughout 1944, potentially delaying Soviet offensives, prolonging the European war, killing thousands of additional merchant seamen and military personnel. The strategic paralysis imposed by Tirpitz's mere existence, capital ships tied to defensive positions, convoy routes disrupted, resources diverted, cost Britain more in 1942 alone than the entire X-craft program. Measured by cold strategic calculation, Operation Source represents warfare at its most efficient, minimal resources achieving maximum impact. But the human reality transcends arithmetic. ERA Jack Robinson, blinded by chlorine gas while saving X8, spent 40 years working as a telephone operator for the post office, his damaged vision limiting career options, but never his determination. Sub-Lieutenant John Lorimer, captured with Cameron, married his childhood sweetheart 3 weeks after liberation and raised 5 children in Liverpool. ERA Edmund Goddard returned to his pre-war profession as a coal miner, descending daily into the earth until retirement at 65. These men didn't consider themselves heroes. They considered themselves fortunate to have survived when others didn't. When asked about courage, Goddard's standard response was, "Courage was continuing when you wanted to stop. We all wanted to stop. None of us did." That sustained determination, that refusal to surrender when surrender was the rational choice, that willingness to do what was necessary despite fear and doubt, that ultimately is what Operation Source demonstrated about British character in the darkest period of the war. The story concludes not with triumph, but with quiet recognition that some victories are purchased at costs that can never fully be calculated. In September 1943, 6 tiny submarines challenged the most formidable defenses Hitler's navy could construct. 18 men died. 6 became prisoners. 4 tons of explosives broke a battleship's keel in 2, and Britain's Arctic convoys sailed freely thereafter, delivering supplies that helped crush Nazism. The X-craft crews didn't win the war, but they removed an obstacle that had paralyzed Allied strategy for 20 months, and in doing so, they proved that size matters far less than courage, that innovation defeats fortification, and that British audacity, when properly applied, could shatter German steel. If you found this story of courage and ingenuity compelling, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. These accounts of British determination deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment below. Did you know about Operation Source before today? What other wartime operations should we explore? Your engagement keeps these vital histories alive. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the extraordinary sacrifices that secured our freedom. Remember, the greatest victories are often achieved by the smallest forces with the largest hearts.